We will go ahead and get started. So thank you for joining us today for the STEP Budget Revision Workshop. I know budget revisions are probably not the most exciting part of your week, or at least hopefully not, but I think you'll find the information useful and beneficial. So we're glad that you took the time to join today. So we're going to go ahead and get started. As we go through today, we're going to talk about just some fiscal basics. We're going to break down the various parts of your budget and then talk through how to develop your budget revision, as well as leave some time for question and answers specific to your individual budgets. As we go along though, if you have any questions, please pop those in the chat box. I find if I don't at least put them in the chat box, I'll forget them by the Q&A. So we'll try to answer some as we go along, but we'll definitely get to them during the question and answer. So pop them over in the chat box. And with that, I will turn it over to Donna Sabib-Spurns.
Good morning, everybody, or afternoon, wherever you are. Welcome, and thank you so much for joining this TA session. And budget, just, yeah, it can be a love or hate thing. And hopefully we'll put you at ease and answer some questions and go through some of the items that you need to have to move forward with your budget for the grants coming forthcoming. Thank you for the introduction, Sarah. And so let's go ahead and get started, and we'll talk first about the fiscal basics. Now, when we talk about fiscal basics, we can't start anything out without talking about the allowability, allocability, and reasonableness of a budget. So when you're talking about allowability, it's talking about how reasonable and necessary it is for the program. Is it something that could be allowed? And we have principal guidelines that we'll discuss in a few minutes, but there's a ruling framework that can help decide that. Lots of questions you have to ask yourself, because as I get started, one thing to keep in mind with any kind of budget revisions, that you want to make it so if somebody were to come in and audit your papers and audit your systems, that you have a clear pathway of how you got there. And so answering these questions will help make sure that you have the necessary documentation in case there was some kind of audit. So another question you could ask is the expense in compliance with the laws and regulations in the grant terms? And then to what extent are these allocable? And we'll get into that in a minute. How is it adequately documented, again, in case of an audit, as I discussed? And is it consistent with grantee rules that apply to both the federally funded and non-federally funded activities? So this is a great slide to have to help kind of jog your memory and to talk about some of the fiscal issues that kind of go around the allowability of a budget. Next slide, please. Okay, when we talk about it being reasonable and necessary, every budget item has a story. It can be interpreted in different ways for what may work with one grant and their objectives may not be the same for another grant and their objectives. So it kind of is a case-by-case basis when you're looking for putting your budget together. And keeping these 5 things in mind as far as what's reasonable will be very helpful in, again, providing that framework. Is it reasonable? You know, that's kind of a common sense thing. Are you going to pay $8,000 for one computer? No. So thinking about, is it a reasonable cost to the grant? Does it follow your sound business practices according to what your entity requires? Are you following, making sure you're getting the lowest price, so forth? And again, with market prices in the area, is it prudent under the circumstances? And as COVID has hit, we've had to be very flexible in some of these areas. And it comes with a judgment call. And oftentimes talking to your program officer will help you guide through some of those circumstances that may need to be looked at again. And again, is it consistent with your grantee's policies, with your policy of the entity that you work for, as well as the federal government? Next slide. Okay, to get into a little bit more about allocability, It means the good or service can be assigned to an award or cost objective in accordance with the relative benefit achieved. So if a cost benefits 2 or more projects and you have activities, programs that can be determined without undue effort and cost, it should be an allocated cost to the project based on the proportional benefit. For an example, so you have a project director that works 50% on one of the NOW grants, and then 50% on another project, which we have quite a few of those actually. A laptop purchase for them would be allocated 50% to NOW and 50% to the other. So you want to make sure that it's the correct percentage of use is being considered when you put in that budget item number. And if there are questions, please feel free to put them in the chat box, because some of this is pretty dry stuff, but some things we have to kind of take word for word because these are kind of overarching rules and regulations. So it is a little dry, but if you need some clarification, please let me know. Next slide, please. And I would suggest going through, I don't know, Sarah, can you click on a couple of these just to give them a sense? For example, the uniform administrative and cost principles?
Sure. Let me just switch screens.
Sorry, I kind of threw that on you.
That's okay. You're just going to make sure that I'm on my toes today.
Sorry.
No, it's fine. So let's see. We want the uniform guidance one?
Yeah, just to give them a picture, because these documents are very important. They give you the overall rules and regulations of federal grant funding and are very, very important. And you should have them bookmarked on your computer if you have not yet already. And if it's not working, Sarah, don't worry about it. It's something I don't.
Here we go. So yeah, so you can just pop those in.
Yes, perfect. Thank you so much.
Right there.
And in here, it answers so many, and they've done some, this was just recently upgraded, and they've done a wonderful job of kind of using it in a little bit more layman terms, making it a little bit more user-friendly and search-friendly. And so here, you have a question on budget, what's covered, this is your go-to doc, and the other two that are referenced in that slide as well. But yeah, there's all kinds of audit requirements, what to keep, cost of principles. It has even a little bit of direct and indirect costs, which we'll talk about in a little bit. But this, it really does provide you with kind of a one-stop shop. So if you haven't yet, please make sure to bookmark those. Okay, thanks, Sarah.
No problem. We'll flip back now.
Okay, and then you have some training modules. We really have a bunch of training modules. There's all kinds of resources out there. You do have to dig sometimes, but Sarah did a great job of providing you the links right here. So just pop on those, and they really do give you, so an event you're waiting to hear from me or from Shala, these are the resources that you could go to first. Next slide, please. All right. Okay, if we budgeted for a mandatory grant management, okay, hold on. I can't see that question.
I can read. Yeah,
Perfect.
I can read it out if it's easier.
Yes.
Yeah, if we budgeted for a mandatory grant management meeting travel, is it recommended that this be moved into a different budget resource category for use elsewhere?
It depends. If it was in the travel line, you might want to keep it in the travel line because we don't know how that's going to work. We do know that the next PD meeting will be virtual. So it will probably, generate some excess funds, but don't do anything with it yet because it could change, right? So if the event were at the end of the year, let's say, and you're still having a high travel budget, let's talk, but we can reallocate things as needed, but I wouldn't touch the travel just yet. Does that answer your question? Okay, great. Okay, thanks. All righty, looking at your grant award, we did do some of this earlier in an earlier session as far as an overview of budgets. I mean, overview of your grant program. And block 7 of your GAN looks like this. And it's looking at the authorized funding, the amount, what this action is. They are kind of buried, so hopefully this presentation kind of hits you and directs you to exactly where you need to go to find your information on what is needed for that particular GAN. Just to let you know, whenever we have a change in your program budget, if it has to do anything with project directors, supplement, front loading, change in FTE levels, a GAN is produced. So you'll see, and this will do a great job of highlighting some of those areas to look for. And why did I get this GAN? I didn't do anything. Why did I get this GAN? And so these blocks, we're going to highlight a couple just to show you some useful information. So this particular one is talking about the action, performance period, how much, and what you have this particular budget year. Next slide, please. Your typical budget categories, as you well know, contain these items. And these should, some of you may have money in all of them, and some of you only a few. But these are the typical budget categories that we see in a federal budget for our programs. Next slide, please. So with this particular program, remember, you cannot provide direct services to students and or families. So this is something you will work with myself or Shala. By the way, Shala Ortega, who is the program officer for this program, she is supposed to be back on Thursday this week. She will be your go-to person. She's been on an extended medical leave, and we're crossing our fingers that she will continue to come back on time. And if that's the event, you will probably get another GAN showing her as your program officer. But just as a reminder here, remember, you may not provide any direct services to students or their families. Next slide, please. And another caution, remember, you must supplement, not supplant. No double dipping. Next slide, please. Okay, to break down some of the personnel, we talk about all project staff is being paid through payroll, including part-time staff, or those who have salaries are split amongst different funding sources. Oftentimes you have a coordinator, a director, an admin assistant, some other relative position that you're being paid for is paid through personnel. And it's very, very important that you keep your FTEs up to date, not only because you have a couple of end grants, let's say you have some other federal grants, and that project director is spread across. You need to be accurate. If you have 4 grants and the same project director, that they cannot be more than 0.25 FTE across the board if they're the same person. So please, whether I've seen 0.05 FTE allocated. So if you, please make sure that you accurately portray the FTE of those positions. And then check with your payroll department regarding how extra duty pay is handled. Sometimes, for example, paying staff to attend a training. Some places have substitute teachers that come in and being paid. So that's something you need to work out with your individual finance office. Normally, proposal will likely be used and be using an average salary estimation for these roles. It could make sure you update your budget with accurate salaries as staffs are hired. This is a big problem when it comes to large available balances. Personnel is probably the biggest issue that we have with our budgets because there's so much turnover. And with COVID, that's made it even worse. So you have a constant kind of a revolving door of different people. And as your positions stay empty, of course, that money is just in personnel and fringe, it's just gathering and compiling. And then it becomes problematic. This past year, we had to cut budgets, some of them significantly because they had such high carryovers that they just couldn't spend. And of course, we never want to get to the end of a program year or end of a program and have funds left over. So be careful. and just be cognizant of that. You can't help people when they leave. However, it's needs to be up on the top of the list of priorities to have a system in place for making sure there's succession after somebody vacates, or to really hop on it right away when you're starting your new grant. Slide, please. Okay, Fringe is Fringe, employer paid payroll expenses. These include the health insurance. This includes Social Security, Medicare, workers' comp. That is all covered under your Fringe percentage. Make sure, again, you contact your fiscal office regarding your current Fringe rate. That's not something that comes from us. Be aware that it will vary for each employee's selections. For example, employees that choose not to participate in health insurance. We do have some who work on their spouse's policy, so they won't need to. So just be wary of that. And better to overestimate than underestimate. Make sure to check throughout the year so that you can expend your unused funds accordingly. Because again, Fringe and personnel are those ones that have a tendency to get very high very quickly. Okay, next slide, please. Travel expenses. This is such a heartbreaker. Travel expenses are approved for grant expenses, and they are including, you have airfare, baggage fees, hotel, meals and incidentals, registration fees for conferences or trainings, mileage. You probably all have some training funds. And like I said to Allison earlier, please don't change that. We don't know what COVID will bring. And we much prefer having face-to-face meetings. So keep that kind of close to your heart as you can, because I have faith we will be able to travel again someday. And make sure, this is a good point, make sure to follow the GSA per diem rates, or maybe your organization has their own policy, but make sure you're following them and make sure you're checking with your travel for per diem according to the correct location, etc. Where would relocation costs be budgeted? That's a good question. I would think travel right now, unless otherwise. I'm going to double check on that with our attorneys just to make sure. Relocation. That's a good question. Thank you. I will get back to you on that one. And there may be some other ones that I need to get some advice from our OGC or Office of General Counsel people regarding the money, because that's always a touchy subject. Okay, next slide, please. Oh, wait, did I finish that?
This is travel part 2.
Oh, yes, I'm sorry. Required to allocate funds for the, oh, yes. So you are, in the NIA, you were required to set aside some funding for the project directors meeting. And that hasn't changed. So keep it there just the same, even though this year will be virtual. Just keep the money in there, and hopefully we will be, like I said, we'll have a face-to-face in the coming years. Other potential travel expenses, attending conferences, that's allowable. Mileage for staff to travel to the sites or to the airport, or those mileage are all can be costs that can be charged against the grant. International travel is not really an allowable expense, especially with ours. I know we had one application that wanted to travel to a foreign country, and that was pretty much their entire grant. And unfortunately, I wish we could, but we can't. So normally international travel is not something that's allowable unless there's a very, very good argument. And that would have to have, of course, prior approval. Next slide, please. Okay, so when we're talking about equipment versus supplies, equipment just simply means anything over $5,000. A single item that's over $5,000 would be per unit is an equipment, and this does require prior approval if it's above that threshold. And this is often, like she said, coffee machines, they have some smart boards. There are several items out there. Transportation, there's lots of items that could fall under equipment, but just remember, if it is over 5,000, that you do need to have prior approval. Supplies, items that are 5,000 per unit or under. They do not require prior approval because this could be anything. Supplies can go, I've seen from rock climbing gear to a laptop, to printing expenses, office supplies, or grant use. And so supplies can come under a myriad of items. But if it's under $5,000, that's not something you need to get approval for versus equipment, yes. Let's see, there's a question. Would you expound on prohibition of direct services? What does that exactly mean? It just, when you have a portion of your grant that may be subcontracting to another group, it can't be paid directly to that family. It cannot be paid directly to that person. It has to go through the system directly to the entity itself. Does that help? Okay. Okay, next slide, please. We'll see if she responds. Construction, that's an easy one. Not allowed at all. None, zeros out. Nothing, nada. Okay, next slide. Okay, contracts. External organizations or individuals that have an agreement with you to provide specific services, and they require a certain fee. Your organization, I'm sure, has contract policies, so please make sure you are checking with them. And you do not allow, or they do not allow you to contract with current employees, so make sure you double check with them before you start getting some subcontractors and contractors, if that's in your budget. Ensure that you have a current signed agreement with all of the contractors. Again, that's good record keeping. And it's also best practice to have a clause stipulating how the contract may be terminated. And it could also be a good idea of how it will be maintained. So how it will be monitored for quality, QC, and then as well as how to terminate the contract if things aren't going well or if it's time. Some good examples could be some of the professional development providers, evaluation services, additional staff or services to work with students or staff. These are all examples of contracts found within each program. And of course, they vary from program to program. But just make sure that it's important to have that signed agreement current and on file when you have your contracts. Next slide. Procurement transactions made with grant funds, they must be conducted in a manner providing full and open competition, consistent with the standards set forth under those wonderful grant guidance documents. Use procurement procedures, which reflect state and local laws, to select contractors, providing that those procedures meet certain standards in the Uniform Grant Guidance. Full and open competition, and again, check with your finance office. They may have policies that you need to follow. So please make sure you do check with them when you start doing these contracts. In approving your application, Ed has not approved any specific entities or individuals you may have identified in your application as an evaluator or other potential contractor. So you must select all the contractors in accordance with these requirements. Again, contracting is kind of a big, we could have a session just alone on contracting, but make sure that any of the identified contracting services you have follow these requirements with Uniform Grant Guidance. Please read those carefully as you start up your next year. More information, another good link, technical assistance site. Again, this is very, very helpful. And please, you must give Indian preference when hiring or training. So when you're talking about these contracts and hiring personnel, we do ask and require that you try to provide Indian preference and hiring according to these acts. Next slide, please.
We actually have a quick question on contracting.
Okay, sure.
Yeah,
Yep.
so when contracting with an LEA, if they're the only LEA, such as the County Office of Education, do we need to do a single source documentation?
As a county office of education, do we just need to say, so if there's no, yeah, in a county office of education, there shouldn't be any kind of competitive. Let's see, do we need, I would say single source documentation is all you need at this point. I have to look at, which program is this, Allison? Your Blue Ranch? Yeah, Blue Ranch, okay. But I'm going to take a look at your grant again in your budget and take a look at that, because I don't want to misquote you. And Sharia. Okay. You're just stumping me, Allison. Stop it.
See, you challenged me with the website. Allison finds you good budget stumpers.
Oh, that's great. No, I appreciate the questions. Absolutely. And again, because each program is different, it's like I don't want to answer something when it could be different for another person. So I will definitely get back to you specific to your program. And answer all the ask all the questions you want to. Okay, so for the other category, this is pretty ambiguous on purpose. It's kind of a catch-all. And we use these for expenses that just don't quite fit into the others. Stipends to elders, that's a great example. It could also be under contracts. So you want to double check again with your personal payroll department. We talk about rental fees for facilities. That would be a direct cost thrown under other as well. So those are common examples for other, but when it just doesn't quite fit, I'd say throw it in the other category. That's easy. Next slide, please. And direct costs, as I was saying, it can be identified specifically with particular cost objectives of your grant program. It can be grant, contract, project, function, or activity. There are certain specific terms detailed in your project budget for these direct costs, and which are those budget categories that we shared earlier. Next slide, please. We did do a huge indirect cost presentation with our attorneys when we had the welcome kickoff presentation. And just to kind of reiterate these costs that have been incurred for the common or joint purposes. So indirect costs, it's such a complicated topic. And the best way I've always been able to kind of picture it myself is the overall umbrella intangible costs that are incurred from a business that you can't see. So costs that benefit the entire organization that cannot be specifically identified to one cost objective. It's used kind of like the overall common or joint purposes, and the rate that has been negotiated is different for each federal agency, providing which one funding picks up its fair share of indirect costs. So the rate is between you, your entity, and the federal agent into which you applied. And I think it gets into it the next slide. So when you talk about some of these indirect costs, we talked about direct costs. Now these are some of those indirect expenditures. Utilities, again, when I say intangible, something that you can't see is a direct costing. Okay, this is for travel. Whereas utilities is something, you know, that's there and it's a part of your need to work your grant. However, it's provided by your entity, and it can include maintenance, some human service resources allocation, some financing, payroll, executive costs. These are all typical indirect cost expenditures, and that percentage that you have agreed upon, which everyone's is different, has been kind of vetted on these typical items or their cost rate. Next slide, please. When you talk about an indirect cost rate agreement, first, we need to have it. If you are claiming it in your budget, we have to have a current one on file. They can sneak up on you. A lot of people don't realize they expire. So please make sure that yours is up to date. You cannot claim indirect cost rates without it. And so make sure that you have one on file with us. I haven't had a chance to go through the program yet your grants to see and make sure that they were all uploaded. And Sarah, maybe you guys have been working with that. I don't know if you know that at all either, but make sure there's a current cost rate for each of your programs if you are claiming the cost. It's signed by the federal agency and an authorized representative of that non-federal entity, such as a CEO, CFO, or comptroller, and establishes an indirect cost rate for the entities to use these administrative costs as a reimbursement for running the grant. Okay, so some of those intangibles, that's what we charge, what you charge to help fund and run your grant. Next slide, please. And you may have seen this before, but these are great, great resources that talk all about indirect cost rates. We may even do a webinar sometime in the future just on indirect cost rates because it's such a big topic for all of our grantees and for OIE. So here, if you have any questions, go to these items to help answer them. I'm sure you can find an answer with them. Or I think there's also a help desk. Well, I know there's a help desk for Ed, and here it is. Good old Andre. We've been sending people to Andre for the past couple of weeks. He's gonna kill us. But no, he's there and very happy to help. He's awesome. So if you cannot find your answer in anything, please, without fail, talk to Andre at this email and he will fill you in anything and everything indirect cost related. Next slide, please. Training. So some of our grants that we offer have training costs. This step does not. So there should never be any kind of training in that. That's mainly for professional development grants. And that this is not that. So please make sure there is a zero in your training items. Next slide. And this is a good slide because this provides some common expenses that many people have. We talked about the international travel. We talked about and we're going to get into talking about food and all those things in a minute, but we do not allow direct services to students and our family, which we talked about earlier. Incentives or awards. I wish we could. It would be great if we could provide those trophies and so forth to many of our youth who have made great milestones, attained great milestones, but it's normally a no expense. Any kind of promotional materials, meals for program participants, and we'll get into that in just a second, and of course, international travel. But these are some common no expenses. And again, they're in particular, there could be some kind of extenuating circumstance. So when she says common, that's exactly what it is. They're commonly, but who knows, there could be exceptions. So make sure to talk to the program officer if you have a question on that. So here, I'm not going to read this verbatim, but meals and meetings, and I'd like, when you have a copy of this, please take a moment and read this. And I believe Sarah's going to put a link in the chat box to a wonderful FAQ document regarding food and meals in grant funding and budgets. So the overall consensus is that there's a very high burden of proof laid on you, the grantee, to show how food is a necessary, reasonable, allocable, and allowed cost for your particular grant. So when there's a meeting, we say grantees should structure their agenda so that there is time built in so participants can go grab something to eat on their own. When planning a meeting, grantees may want to consider locations where they're not out in the middle of nowhere and there's other places to eat. So those are things to take into consideration with your funding. While these determinations will be made case by case, there could be times where it is permissible. So you have to make a compelling case. So the onus is on you to provide the justification for meeting. So potlatch for kickoff would not be a necessary cost. However, snacks for a after school service program or something may need to be, and that is covered. So it is a case by case. but there are general cost principles in the FAQ that document we'll share will be very helpful. Let's use a couple questions. Can we purchase food for a stakeholder meeting? What do you mean after? Oh, after COVID, after COVID. So is it necessary? Is it reasonable cost? Is it something that we do just to make it kind of into, if it's not a necessary cost, then we say generally no. But if it's an integral part to help you meet your grant goals and objectives, then it's yes. So again, you'll have to talk to me individually to see what stakeholder meeting this is, what it's for. But food, it's just a tricky topic. Angela said we weren't providing the handout. Oh, sorry. I was reading that. Right. So we'll get back to that link because I was thinking we could share it in the chat, the link, but not the actual document. But I'll double check and see where OGC stands on that. Okay, next slide. Thanks, Carl. So here's some guidance, more guidance that you can check around food. In virtually all cases, using grant foods to pay for food and beverages and networking session is just not a justified cost. It's, again, rarely considered necessary to achieve the purpose of the meeting. So again, we'll talk on a case by case, and you can plead your cases to how you can justify it. I know that some of our family get-togethers, that could be an integral part of a goal objective. And so whereas that could be considered allowed. So it's just in the context of how it's being used is what the question is. And it's up to you to make sure you can provide proof and an audit that shows, yes, this was a allocable and reasonable cost to our grant. Okay. Next slide, please. And the ones I like, the yes expenses. I always like saying yes to money because it means we're spending it for our kids. Moving fund with budget categories. So budgeted for 5 laptops at $2,000. Laptops are on sale for $1,500 each. Move the savings to purchase additional instructional materials. So a lot of times I've had to work with grantees when they get stuck on, well, we purchased all the laptops and we got it at a cheaper price. Well, then great. Let's get something else that you could use to help your meet your program objectives. For example, if you have a literacy focused grant, go out and buy more books. Use that extra. And if you have to reallocate it to another column, it's fine. Under 10% of your budget, you can do that. Moving funds between budget categories, you can fill a staff position. You move salary from personnel to contractual if you have to end up using a contract to hire. Contract with a person or entity to fill similar responsibilities. And again, remember, this is very important because a lot of this gets lost a lot. You can move up to 10% of your overall award without any approval from your program officer. There are some certain exceptions, but those we're not going to get into those at the moment. But 10% you can do. Now remember, equipment that's over $5,000, you still need to have approval for that. But you may reallocate 10% of your entire award to the approved budget categories. Now, if you have a budget that originally was a zero item, you do need to have permission to add money into that budget category. But if there is already an existing amount in that budget, it's free. Free for all. You can move as you need and see fit. Of course, with the exception of your indirect cost rate. But yes, please make a note of that. You can do that. There's flexibility there, and a lot of people that gets lost in the message somehow. But okay, next slide, please. So with the budget changes requiring approval, and we did go over this in some of the other grant webinars, but it's very important to change in key personnel. We know it happens a lot. Please, especially with project directors. Matter of fact, I sent out a message and I got several dings back and kickbacks from emails, which means the project director is not current. We need to keep these records current. And with COVID, there's been a lot of changes. So please keep your budget up to date with current key personnel, changing them, working with the program officer, myself or Shala to do that. Change from direct to contracting of services requires approval. Equipment, travel, if it's a huge, if you're moving a large amount of money, best practice is to keep your program officer up to date on all your budget changes. When in doubt, ask. I mean, that's what we're here for. So if there's something that you just aren't sure of and you want to be sure of, we appreciate that. So please contact us anytime about that. I love how you preface your question, so I won't forget, Allison. I'm right there with you.
Yeah, and before we go into this next session, might be a good time to do this one. So her question was, her indirect cost rate was lowered by 9.65% as of January 1st, 2021, so upcoming. And thus they're going to need to rebudget that difference back into their direct budget. Will this require an approved budget adjustment since it's moving from indirect to direct?
It needs to be notated with your program officer. It doesn't, if it's, I don't know what your rate was before, but it shouldn't, you just need to move it and let your program officer know where you changed it. So you don't.
Going from basically 30% to 10%.
Yeah, that's a significant difference. So you have the option of putting in where you need to based on your goals and objectives, but please make sure to notate to Shala or myself how you and where you do that. Okay, that's a good question. That's a big change.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, developing a budget revision. Sarah, you are it.
All right, so as you're all starting to develop your budget revisions, we do have an optional budget revision tool that we're providing for you. So I'll be sending out the slide deck and this spreadsheet as well, but wanted to kind of talk through for you how this tool works and why it may be helpful for you as you are putting together your budget revision. So oftentimes when we've done budget revisions previously, we've gone back into our grant and tried to do them in whatever format our grant writer put them in, which we may or may not have access to that original document. The formatting may be a little wonky, and it can sometimes just be a little bit challenging. So kind of the perks of using the optional tool is that it's going to make sure that you've got everything there that your program officer needs in order to approve your budget revision. It's going to do the addition and subtraction for you so that you don't have to worry about those math mistakes that are so easy for all of us to make as we're doing all this figuring. And it's also going to just make it nice and neat. And then lastly, when you go back and maybe need to do another budget revision, potentially in January or come July, when you see those payroll changes and you've got some excess funds you need to move, then you can take this form, make some simple changes, and resubmit your next budget revision. So it is an Excel spreadsheet. It's pretty easy to use, but there are a few things just to kind of denote. So particularly at the top, making sure to put your full grantee organization name, your PR award number, and then your project director name, because that's what everything is filed under. Then as we go over into the actual budget, all of the budget categories are already provided for you. And anywhere where it says expenditure is where then you can pop in your individual expenditures within that category. And you can, of course, add as many rows as you might need. Then when you put your amounts out, it will total them into each category. So this kind of lovely salmon color is your existing grant budget. So when you look at your actual grant application, you'll just copy it in just as it is in your grant application, because that's technically your current approved budget. So just pop those amounts in. And then we'll move over into the green, which is what you would like your budget to be, or what you need your budget to be to run your program this year. So in the budget changes column, just enter the amounts that you are taking away from a particular row or adding to. So, and I'll give you some examples here. We'll go into the spreadsheet live. The big thing to remember here is if you're taking away, make sure to make it a negative number. So if you're taking away $1,000 from that row, just put negative sign 1,000, it'll do it for you. And if you're adding 1,000, just type 1,000 and it will calculate all of that across for you. The total revised budget, you don't actually have to type anything in that column. And that's honestly for safety purposes to, again, kind of protect against those mathematical whoopsies, because it's going to take your existing budget, make those changes that you put in budget changes, and it'll tell you what your revised budget is for your line items as well as your total categories here in bold. It'll also tally up your totals here at the bottom. Unless you've had a budget reduction from your proposed budget and your grant, then these numbers in the salmon and the final column should equal out and your budget changes should equal 0. If you've had a budget reduction, then you will see a difference there, of course. And then finally, the most important column is your explanation column. Providing a great explanation is what will allow your program officer to quickly and easily approve your budget revision. So you can put as much information as you need to in there, both in that expenditure when you're describing it and then describing here. I like to try to keep my expenditure explanation here, my kind of title, a little more brief, just so that it's easy to read down, and then put, you know, a lot more of my information here in my explanation. That's just personal preference for making it easy to read. But the important thing is to describe why you've moved the monies the way that you have and how this is going to help you achieve your grant goals and objectives. Because remember, any of these changes have to still be within the scope of your grant and help you meet those goals and objectives. So it's really important to tie it back to that. And that's why you're making those changes.
Mm-hmm.
So we'll look at a quick example and then I'll go into the actual document. So you can see here kind of just a sample of what it might look like completed. And you'll see that there hasn't been an explanation in every single row because I'm only providing explanations for those lines in which I've actually made a budget revision, because everything else was already approved. So you can see, like, if my fringe rates tend to change year to year. They, for some reason, human resources never keeps that the same. So if you've had maybe an increase in fringe rate, they do tend to go up, not down, then you may need to allocate a few more funds into there. So, you know, putting that in, make sure to denote that. I saw some of you had allocated funds to go to the NIEA conference. Well, since it was virtual, you didn't have those travel expenses. You only had the registration fee. So of course, you're going to have some cost savings there. Things like you may need to make some movement. So I know for some, you might have had laptops classified under equipment. So this is when you would go ahead and move that over to supplies, because unless you're getting quite the primo laptop, it's going to be under $5,000. And so you're going to be able to have that in that supplies area. I know some folks may be needing to, because of COVID and all of us working remotely, you may need some software licenses for online meetings. So that may be a whole new expense. You'll see it wasn't in this fake original budget, but now we know that we're going to need it because we're going to be virtual still for a while. Okay. So plugging those things in and everything will calculate. Carl, I see you saying if we make a change to FTE, do we denote those as well, or just enter the salary fringe change? Yes, you'll definitely want to enter in the change to the FTE, because we always want to make sure that the program office is aware of the FTEs. And you can even, one thing that I sometimes do is I'll actually put it in parentheses after the personnel. You know, if each one is just one, I'll say project director and in parentheses 0.5 FTE, just to really call it out. So that's an option too. We're just here in the explanation, but definitely denote that.
And there also needs to be a change in G5 to reflect, if it's for like the project director, of course, then that we need to have that reflected in G5 as well. And one more thing about, well, two more things about that wonderful form. I have seen some with the explanations have been due to COVID, and then it's just copy and pasted through all the different category line items, and it's not helpful. So if you can make sure, it really does help us understand the purpose. It doesn't have to be a long story. It just needs to say due to, extra funds from an NIA move to this to pay for extra supplies. That's all, but please try to avoid some of those canned comments because it's not very helpful when we have to approve the budget. And also one other thing, this is fabulous. It is not a required form. Some of you have used some from other, perhaps you are an NYCP grantee and have used and adjusted those, and it's fine, whatever works best for you. However, this particular budget, it's so easy to use, and Sarah did a fantastic job making it so user-friendly, and with the formulas built in, it calculates things for you and hopefully makes your life a little bit easier. But again, this is not required. It's optional for you. So I need to make that disclaimer, but it's great. I'd use it if it were me.
Yeah. And if you have any questions about it, we'll put in the emails to get help with that as well. But I just wanted to show you also live how this works. So you'll see if I'm going to put in my project director at 0.5 FTE, and then however much they're going to make in my original, maybe they were actually a little less. So remember, I put in my negative and I take away however much I need from that line item, and you'll see the math just does it for you. Now you'll notice if I try to change personnel, it's going to say no, because that's a required category for your budget. So it's not going to let you take away a category. Same thing if you try to type here and you're like, no, I think that's actually 67,000. It's going to say, no, we know how to do the math. Don't fiddle with it. So any of the totals and any of the categories, it's not going to let you change, but any of these expenditures, you're able to change across and then put in your explanations. If your explanation were to get lengthier, you can always, drag it down and make that box lengthier to show your full explanation. If you have more things, this is the one thing that's my big tip for the spreadsheet, is if you need to add rows, the easiest way to do it that will ensure all the formulas come with you is to pick the last one, the last row in that category. And then when you hit insert, all the formulas come with you. Okay, so, and you can do that over and over, if you have 10 different personnel roles or 10 different things in supplies. And you just pop all that in and you'll see it's going to keep totaling up. And that way you can keep making your adjustments until your budget changes zero out and you get everything balanced. Then just save it and then email that in to Donna and Shala and they will get it approved for you. Mm-hmm. Now I'll pop back over as I'm popping back over when I get in and we move on to the next, I'll share in the chat box our technical assistance email address as well as my direct email address. If as you're working on it, if you have questions about, the form or anything like that, you can always reach out and I'm happy to help.
Great. Okay, so the budget revisions, that's just a simple tool. I thank you so much for putting that together, Sarah. I think that's a wonderful option and hopefully will be such a time saver for you and for grantees and for us. So we do ask for these grant budgets to be submitted no later than November 16th, close of business. And go ahead and email them to Shala unless otherwise directed. If for some reason that her return is delayed, we will definitely let you know and you'll be sending them to me. But for now, just plan on sending them to Shala directly. And Sarah did add in the chat box, the TA, the OIE technical assistance team, the email address. So please make sure this is added to your contacts so it won't get bounced back. Then there's Sarah's individual email there too. If you have any other technical assistance questions, maybe she can help you. You've reached out and we just haven't had a chance to answer you yet. Sarah is always a great resource for that. So thank you, Sarah. Any questions? We are almost time, so this is great. Any extra questions that you may have?
Yeah, and as you're putting in any final questions, I'll go ahead and pop up our convenient contact list here.
Yes, yes. And this is snapshot of pretty much everybody. We can't run and we can't hide. But do please contact us anytime and we will be happy to get and help you. And with your individual questions, and Allison, I'll have to get back to you. I definitely will on your questions on reallocation in single source.
And then Sarah, the other Sarah, has also popped over in the chat box a convenient link to the feedback survey. We would greatly appreciate it. Takes literally 2-3 minutes at the max if maybe your internet is not quite as fast. It's a super easy, super short form. So we would greatly appreciate if, as you're wrapping up your time with us today, if you'd click on that SurveyMonkey link and knock out that quick feedback survey.
It's very helpful. We do read it. The project director reads it. And it gives us some good ideas about what you still may need, what we could focus on to help you with certain TA. It's in that short survey, it says a lot. So I really appreciate you taking the time to fill that out.
All right, and if anybody has any final questions, we're a pretty small group, so you're also welcome
Yeah,
to
it's nice.
unmute and
For a
ask.
change, I could see everybody all at once.
And then we'll be sending out the slide deck as well as that optional budget tool after the event today.
Yes, and please make sure those links, just make them on your bookmarks, and you will refer to them a lot, I imagine, hopefully. It's a great resource.
All right, well, it looks like we have hit all the questions. So make sure to grab the SurveyMonkey link from the chat box, and then we will see you next time. Have a great